Assalamu alaikum fam, hope you're doing well, relaxing outside in the beautiful rain, and I want to talk to you. So, Derek from Myth Vision had some points that got me to thinking about our Prophet, peace be upon him. So, he said a lot of things I didn't agree with in his approach about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So, what did Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, bring us? He brought us a superior form of patriarchy. He brought us back gender roles. He showed us how a man can be a husband to multiple women, and a warrior, and a politician, because he had to rule. And he showed us how you are supposed to reward your companions, and how you're supposed to keep your duty and obligations to Allah. And he showed us how you can have time to pray, and how you are supposed to have a superior endurance for stress and problem solving, and to be totally steadfast without becoming nuts. This is something that is different from Buddha, different from the classical interpretations of Jesus, and makes our Prophet, peace be upon him, very unique. And very few philosophers, and nearly none scientists, have the same track record of overcoming as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I think that the reason why so many people mock the Prophet who are not religious is because they have lost the ability to recognize and appreciate strength. Strength is necessary. Duty towards your wives is necessary. These tribalistic ignoramuses on Derek's channel of Myth Vision seem to have a strange obsession with mockery. It's really quite strange. They seem to get a lot of dopamines from being cruel, from not trying to understand the Islamic perspective, but instead degrade everything down to myths. That would be like taking certain scientists and comparing them to pseudoscience. There's a certain point where you have to distinguish and give a principle of charity to those whom you're dealing with. Our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a real person, and he fulfilled his duties towards Allah, towards his soldiers, towards his wives, and towards his ummah, his followers. Show me a scientist who has bled for his research. Show me a scientist who was on the battlefield. Show me a scientist who had the duties towards his wives fulfilled. Not one who he occasionally touches once a week. But to be polygamous means you have way more ability to understand the women's mindset, to keep them around you. And not only that, he was not rich at the time he had many of those women, and they decided to stay and not leave. Whereas today, if you notice, a lot of the tech geeks go to Amsterdam, they go to San Francisco, they go to these illicit areas to purchase women for money because they're too socially awkward to deal with women. Whereas our Prophet was not socially awkward with women and had no problem fulfilling his obligations to them concerning the marriage bed. Further, scientists are notorious for not being masculine. They're notorious for being people with no fashion sense pretty eccentric, pretty poor in hygiene, and also, wearing the same thing all the time. And this eccentricity is something I think is pretty cool, but they are not somebody who's masculine. Scientists have their role, nerdy, skinny intellectuals who belong in a lab. They don't belong leading empires. They are not sufficient to motivate soldiers. There's not going to be a chemistry teacher, on the battlefield getting ready to go into a tank and can get certain soldiers to follow them into the field. They're behind the scenes. They're not on the vanguard. So, it's so cool to admire people who are in a lab 70 hours a week, but you must not denigrate masculinity. And a lot of these nerdy guys, they have Adderall. Adderall was really big in the tech community, to where they need Adderall, energy drinks, and they look up to superheroes. So they replace religion with superheroes, comic books, and video games, and they express themselves through art instead of being it, which, cool, good for them. But the whole point is this. Our prophet was someone who people wanted to fight alongside and pledge their lives to and their salvation on. They believed in him. And that is something that a scientist has not ever been able to garner. Sure, you can look up to Galileo, you can look up to Copernicus, but most of the atheists today who are fedora wearing neckbeards, they usually have George Carlin and, Hitchens, Harris, and such. And it's like, that's your role model? That's somebody who you want to kind of carry their sandals? I think that you have to have your proper place for scientists, and you have to have the proper place for your warriors, for your leaders. A scientist can tell you a boring book about female psychology, but Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, demonstrates with his life how he had the potency, the endurance, the patience to actually have those multiple wives. I feel like Derek from Myth Vision kind of doesn't want to see any of the strength in Islam. Dude was a former drug addict who has dad issues, who likes Dragon Ball Z, and seems to want to get money from women in their 40s who are fat and, lonely, and he's willing to take their money and be a little hot patati boy for super chats. It's kind of just odd, because he is a former soldier from my understanding, so he has that typical pretty boy Americana vibe going on, which is very popular amongst middle-aged women who are resentful that they have lost some sense of spirituality and they want some eye candy while they're on YouTube. And Derek, with his lighting, the way he does his hair, his natural beauty, fulfills that. And because he's taken a sort of antagonistic approach against superior masculine Muslims, these women feel validated because they've been neglected by Muslim men. Derek had an interesting thing where he said, like, oh, me and my wife, when we see a beautiful woman, we say something, oh, she's really pretty. Which, to me, I know that type of psychology, and his wife sounds like somebody who's willing to let her man be a sex object for other women for money, right? She doesn't seem to have any sort of protective jealousy over her man, and she seems to get stimulated by her man looking at other women. So you can kind of see an insight of her morals just from that slip that he had, and that he would disrespect his wife by looking at other women, and then her being okay with it. Meanwhile, he's, slandering the prophet, peace be upon him, for having multiple wives. So it's okay for him to look at other women, not lower his gaze in front of his wife, but it's bad for Muslims to have wives and lower their gaze and be modest, and women to cover up and have a sense of modesty and decency and not being objects of the male gaze. See what I'm saying? It seems a little bit of backwardsness. And our prophet brought us Tawheed. He brought us the most purest form of monotheism that lifts the shackles of depending on crystals and bracelets and attachment to objects, material items, and lower ideals, right? And then he said something along the lines of God does a sort of flex in the mirror like a god who's in the gym looking at his muscles. And it's like, what a derogatory, simplistic, stupid way to look at it. Really quite strange. Because to have an all-powerful God gives you comfort and knowing that eventually evil will lose. But that you have to have fear in your heart, admiration, awe, in the sublime power of Allah, and to be steadfast and to know that God is strong and God is not weak, and that Shaitan will have multiple ways of tempting you, and that you need to overcome that. It's interesting that Derek was a soldier, but he's failed to perceive that. But I think it makes sense because he was a heroin addict. And the fact that you'll inject things into your veins like heroin, and heroin makes you fall asleep and makes you completely weak, it kind of shows his internal weakness for strength. A soldier who needs heroin is a pretty bad soldier, I'd argue. And he seems to have lost his faith and now wants to treat everything as mythical. And he doesn't even dive into, like, if you want to analyze Zeus, you can do it in a way where you understand how the Greeks and the Romans looked upon those deities and what was the principles they extracted from them and what type of consciousness it produces. It seems like he's incapable of analyzing the essence and consciousness that stems from certain behaviors, certain choices of religious figures. And I find this quite odd. Really quite odd. Further, our prophet, peace be upon him, brought us discipline. Just Dawkins, when you look at him, you see academic discipline, but you don't see discipline as in war. It's interesting that a soldier would not like the values of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, concerning his ability to fight next to his soldiers, right? A man who fights with his soldiers is superior than the scientist who hides in his lab and just takes orders and doesn't do any of the fighting himself. Something slimy about those scientists who create chemicals that are used in war illegally, instead of getting on a horse, picking up a sword and going, or getting in a tank, or pulling the trigger themselves. They create weapons that you use from far away. And indeed, they're going to lead us into the robotics future, right? Which will make people be able to harm one another through, gamers getting into the robotics field, because the new warfare will be AI. The new warfare will be people operating robots from a distance. And the controls will be suited towards gamers, so the best gamers in the world will be able to operate these mechanics and switching back and forth of these controllers to control the robots, which will then be the new form of warfare, along with cyber warfare and space warfare. So it won't be the traditional on the ground face to face anymore, which makes us more cowardly and makes, death more easy because you don't really see the consequences of what you did. You're far away, so genociding a bunch of people becomes easier because you don't see visually what happened, and your soul doesn't receive the upgrade or degradation from the action you took. And then the commanders, they don't know the cost of war because they're cut off from it because it's just a screen. And the robot is not going to have any type of feeling towards the people they're genociding. And it's going to be a very bleak future. So our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, brought us insights on marriage, gender roles, patriarchy, masculinity, tawheed, discipline. He's superior to Sam Harris. He's superior to George Carlin. All George Carlin did was tell you a couple jokes. Okay? To worship a comedian is pretty stupid. And don't tell me they don't worship him. I mean, they repeat his jokes as if they're prayers. It's quite strange. It's quite strange how atheists now turn towards mocking and then turn towards trusting scientists as if they can never be evil, as if they can never be weapons of the government. And scientists are a very poor example of patriarchy, of masculinity, of discipline, of marriage and gender roles, especially because they're the most socially awkward, sexually underdeveloped, feminine type men. There's difference between an older scientist, you see him very respectfully. But, like I said, a lot of the tech people purchase women. They don't necessarily have the same finesse as a masculine Muslim male who is steadfast. I think a better example, let's put it this way. A jihadi warrior versus a soft computer engineer who doesn't even know what it's like to hold a weapon. Right? Or a computer person guy in a lab doing something strange. Manipulating viruses, creating chemicals for war, creating perfumes, whatever it is that the chemical person is doing in the different forms of science. But those men are the ones who listen to Jocko Willink. Those are the ones who spend a lot of money on video games, comic books, and other means of trying to identify again with their male roots. And a lot of those scientists, nerdy men, have very low testosterone and have problems with women. So, before you make fun of our Prophet, peace be upon him, you need to look at what he brought. And if his warrior spirit bothers you, it's because you're weak. It's because you're meant to be a servant. It's because you're a serf. It's because you're not a leader. It's because you've never had to endure a challenge. And it's because no one would follow you, no one would die with you, and no one would serve you to the point of enduring hardships with you, and no one sees you as worthy of being followed. No one sees you as honorable, so maybe you shouldn't judge. If your own manager doesn't respect you at work, if your own wife doesn't respect you, if you have to pay for women to pay attention to you, then you shouldn't judge our Prophet. Because our Prophet didn't have to pay for women's attention, and didn't have to live through Superman, and didn't have to watch movies in order to feel valid. So, again, that's what I'd say.